Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 11. We're starting to talk about Westward Expansion, which is really kind of interesting to me because we start to see the desire of the people who were calling themselves Americans. So we have an American identity, and we will discuss so much about Westward Expansion. This time, this week, we're focusing on 1800 to 1860. Basically, ever since colonists arrived along the East Coast, we've been moving west. And that westward expansion has pushed people aside. So it's dislocated natives who were here first. So in this chapter, like I said, we're specifically looking at westward expansion from 1800 to 1860. So by the end of this chapter, you'll be able to discuss the United States acquisition of some Spanish territory, how Texas became the Lone Star Republic, and the details of the Missouri Compromise. Before we get into that, I want to show you a painting that is actually from a period just after the time period we're talking about. It's by John Gast. It's called American Progress, and he painted it in about 1872. In this painting, you see the figure of Columbia, this goddess who represents the United States and the spirit of democracy, and she's making her way westward, literally bringing light into the darkness. You can see that behind her, there's light and progress, and in front of her, there's darkness and the old ways. So, as far as the old ways, we see Native Americans. They're running because they're scared of her. We also see, in terms of transportation, we see horses and people walking on foot. But the progress behind Columbia, you can even see a train in the background. This is really actually like this visual representation of transportation, the history of transportation through 1872 at this point. So, Columbia, this fair skinned person, is making her way into this dark, wild, untamed territory that's full of danger. Because of the color of her skin, because of her fairness, it tends to denote the idea that white people will bring refinery to this wild, dangerous West. And she represents the ideal, which obviously will not go well for the Native Americans who are living in the West because these people are going to be pushed aside, just like they have been all along. Something else I wanted to point out about this painting is that I had a friend a, a little while back who was doing some genealogy research, and she called and said, "What is the Star of Empire?" Like, it really sounds like a train. So we start talking about it, the Star of the Empire. What is that? We start looking. Everything came back to this painting. And so if we could zoom in very close, we would see that Columbia has a crown, and that crown was referred to as the Star of the Empire. So my friend's, the obituary that she found said that this descendant of hers moved to Arkansas on the Star of the Empire. Like, it still sounds like a train to me, It just sounds like a train name. However, the Star of the Empire just basically referred to manifest destiny. So she had descendants who left the East and moved west, crossed the Mississippi into Arkansas based on manifest destiny, which was a cool find for doing some genealogy research. All right, so this is our timeline. It kind of puts things into perspective with Lewis and Clark. We've talked about them in a previous chapter, so we're not going to go into that here. In this chapter, we're going to focus mostly on the Missouri Compromise, Texas, and a little about the California Gold Rush. Before we do that, though, I want to go back, kind of backtrack a little bit to Sacagawea and her role in the Lewis and Clark expedition. A lot of times as a child, we hear Sacagawea was a tour guide for Lewis and Clark, and it gives us some sort of idea of the empowerment of women, the role that this Native American woman had to help plot out the map of our country, all of this exciting stuff. But the real story of Sacagawea was really dark. She was the daughter of a Shoshone chief, so she was kind of like a princess by our terms. She was captured by a rival tribe and sold into slavery. The French-Canadian trapper who bought her made her his wife when she was only 12 years old. She was one of Charbonneau's wives, and they lived among the Hidatsa and Mandan tribes in the area that's now known as North Dakota. Legend tells us that Sacagawea was the interpreter for the Lewis and Clark expedition, but really it was her husband who was hired for that job. So he was hired for the job. She did the job. But anyway, he was the one who got paid for that job. She did go along despite being pregnant. She actually gave birth on the trip in February 1805. She made herself useful by finding edible plants and helping to maintain the cargo. Plus, just her presence along with the baby in the group made them seem less suspicious and more trusting because, there's a woman and child along. So these people obviously weren't looking for a fight. Along the way, she was able to reunite with her long-lost brother, who was the leader of a Shoshone tribe that they encountered. This connection made it possible for them to buy horses to help the expedition cross the Rocky Mountains. Clark grew very fond of Sacagawea's baby and even offered to pay for him to have an education. After the expedition ended, Sacagawea's husband took their baby to visit Clark and left him there. A few years later, Sacagawea had a daughter, and after Sacagawea died, Charbonneau took the daughter and left her with Clark, and Clark actually raised both of those children. I thought that was kind of an interesting thing about Sacagawea that we didn't cover when we talked about Lewis and Clark before, so I wanted to be sure to include that here. This is an illustration on the history of the Canadian beaver. It shows how beaver skins were used, or beaver pelts were used, for trim and for stylish hat making. In 2015, a reported 500,000 plus beavers were harvested annually in North America. In 2019, California's Wildlife Protection Act of 2019 made California the first state to ban trapping of the gray fox, the coyote, the beaver, the badger, and mink, and also made it illegal to sell their pelts. So we still have a fur trade, and California is cracking down on it in their state. So the area of Florida that's commonly and jokingly referred to in our area as the Redneck Riviera was once known as West Florida. We're talking specifically about the Panhandle area. In 1783, some American immigrants moved into West Florida. In 1810, these American settlers in West Florida decided they'd rebel against Spain because Spain owned Florida, and declare independence. President James Madison and Congress really kind of jumped on board with the idea because they knew the Spanish government was weak after Napoleon's invasion of Spain. So James Monroe was president when Andrew Jackson took control of the Spanish forts at Pensacola and St. Mark's in an 1818 raid against the Seminoles and escaped slaves. So the idea was that Jackson executed a couple of British citizens in the territory and claimed that they had incited the Native Americans and runaways. President Monroe was going to denounce these raids, but the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, said, no, let Jackson do his thing. He said that Jackson had to restrain the natives and the escaped slaves since Spain had failed to do so. So Monroe let it go. To clarify the Spanish territory, the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 defined the western boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase, and Spain gave up its claim to a section of the Pacific Northwest, which made it a shared property then between the U.S. and Great Britain. In return, the U.S. recognized Spain's sovereignty in Texas. So this is how these things are starting to come into play. And we will double back in just a moment to show you shared territory. The shared territory in the Northwest, I'm sorry. Let's see. So as the nation continued to grow, some people wanted to continue slavery and others wanted to abolish it. The Missouri Compromise was an effort to please both of these groups, the people who wanted slavery and the people who didn't. Another consideration was maintaining the balance of power in Congress so that slave states or abolitionist states wouldn't have more power than the other. So basically, the Missouri Compromise determined that Missouri would be admitted as a slave state and Maine at the same time would be admitted, but as a free state. Also, the Missouri Compromise forbid any future slave states in the Louisiana Purchase that was above the 3630 parallel, which is the southern border of Missouri, with the exception, of course, of Missouri itself, because Missouri was a slave state above that border. By the early 1830s, the lands east of the Mississippi had been settled and admitted to the Union as states. The land west of the river, though, in this contemporary map, united with the settled areas and the body of an eagle symbolizing territorial ambitions of the United States, remained largely unsettled. So I love this because it shows the eagle, right? Isn't that kind of cool? Anyway, of course, our map is going to look very different from that by the time the United States is complete. This 1833 map shows the extent of land grants made by Mexico to American settlers in Texas. Nearly all are in the eastern portion of the state, one factor that led to war with Mexico in 1846. So, since the U.S. recognized Spain's sovereignty in Texas, remember the Adams-Onis Treaty? Mexico actually welcomed American settlers by giving them some land grants. Most of these land grants were on the eastern part of the state of what we're talking about now, the area that we know as Texas. The problem with Texas is that its western section was filled with Native Americans who were hostile to imposers. So, they gave the land grants to the people in the eastern part of the state because the western part was too dangerous. Mexico recruited impresarios. These are people who brought settlers to regions in exchange for land grant. One of these impresarios was Moses Austin, who wanted to take 300 Americans into Texas. Spain agreed if they would all convert to Roman Catholicism. After his death, Moses Austin's son, Stephen Austin, carried out his father's wish and took his father's land grant and settled the area now known as Austin, Texas. And if you have not been to Austin, I love it. I was there for a conference in 2019, so pre-pandemic, and I wish we had another week to stay there because it was just a really interesting town. There's so much to do. I did not get into any of the comedy clubs that I wanted to go see, but I did do some sightseeing, and that was really cool. Went to a little historic park nearby the hotel and everything. That was cool. Anyway, so soon such land grants meant that American immigrants were outnumbered or were outnumbering the Tejanos. The Tejanos were Mexican residents of the region. Very soon, the Americans wanted to take over the land, and they were very upset when the Mexican government abolished slavery there in 1829. So most of them moved to Texas from southern states, and they had been slave owners. So they wanted to continue slavery. In 1833, a group of American settlers met to write a constitution for an independent Texas. They wanted to suspend taxes. They wanted to return to immigration from the United States. Santa Anna had cut that off for a period of time. They wanted better protection from the Native American tribes, and they wanted more land grants, by golly. So Santa Anna gave in to some of that, but not all of it. He held up on the independence. He said, no, we won't give you independence, but we will reinstate immigration. American Texans met in March 1836 and declared independent from Mexico. They had the support of the Tejanos because they'd heard all of these great stories about the U.S. government. What kind of benefits could they get from that kind of government as well? And these people decided that slavery would not actually be permitted in Texas. So, they've decided this. The Tejanos support that, and they hope for independence and reform and benefits just like the Americans will get. So the link on here is to a song, I believe, about Remember the Alamo. So let's just kind of touch base on the Alamo briefly here. American troops took refuge at the Alamo. There were a total of 200 Americans and 4,000 Mexicans who fought at the Alamo. They fought fearlessly but lost after 10 days. Very few Americans survived. So it was a big loss for the United States troops, for the Americans fighting there. Texas forces under Sam Houston started picking up recruits along their way to San Jacinto. Sorry. And that's Candy barking in the background, sorry. So Sam Houston is picking up recruits along the way because the story of the defeat of the Alamo is growing. And this small group, led by Sam Houston, waits until the Mexican troop took an afternoon nap. And then they rush them with their battle cry, Remember the Alamo. So that's where we get that whole saying. Santa Anna signed a peace treaty and recognized an independent Texas and set the Rio Grande as the southwestern border. But Santa Anna then was removed from power. So the Mexican Congress refused to recognize this peace treaty. So there's an issue. In September 1836, Sam Houston is elected president of Texas. Yes, that's right, president, not governor, not mayor, but president of Texas. Because remember, they have become an independent state from Mexico, not from the U.S. So Texas has won its independence from Mexico. This leads Texans to vote to annex to the U.S., but the U.S. had a problem with it because the United States said, first of all, this will upset the Missouri Compromise because technically, according to it, Texas would be a slave state since it fell under that 3630 parallel. And not to mention, it would upset Mexico-U.S. relations. So, do you really want a continued war with people who are right at your back door like that? I mean, that was something to think about. So Texas just became the independent Lone Star Republic. It did get recognition from France, Great Britain, and Belgium, and the Netherlands, which was important for protection against Mexico. The U.S. did not recognize Texas officially until about a year later when they were able to kind of have a little time, about a year after the Battle of San Jacinto. Texas pushed out Native Americans and the Tejanos. So the Tejanos who supported this effort for independence totally got no benefit at all. This is the area that I mentioned before, the part of the Northwestern Territory Spain had given up, so that now it's occupied by the United States and Great Britain. It's shared between two countries instead of three. So the U.S. wanted Oregon for Pacific Northwest trade with Asia and to have a Northwest post. President Polk was in office when Queen Victoria agreed to set the British boundary at the 49th parallel, which is the current border between the U.S. and Canada. Polk was willing to use force for westward expansion, including California. He set out to capture northern Mexico, which is now what we refer to as New Mexico, Mexico City, and California. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo set the Rio Grande as the U.S.-Mexico border and developed California, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. In 1845, Texas joined the United States. Mexico insisted that the United States had the right only to territory, a smaller section of territory here. You can see the very difference on the map. The disputed territory is the area in stripes. So you can see Spain said, oh yeah, you got this small area here. Hang on just a second. We'll see if I can. See if I can mark on this. Okay, yeah. So Spain says, this is all you got. And the US says, no, this is all we got. So you can see the big difference, right? Between the big circle, the little circle there. So that's an issue. Oops, let me get rid of those marks now. There we go. The anti-Catholic settlement played an important role in the Mexican-American War. The American public widely regarded Roman Catholics as cowardly and vice-ridden, like the clergy in this 1846 lithograph, who are shown fleeing the Mexican town and they're accompanied by pretty women and baskets full of alcohol. So this is something that largely pretty much followed the idea that the United States was predominantly settled by Protestants who already had anti-Catholic notions anyway. Remember, the French and the Spanish were Catholic. It's the English settlers who were not. All right, so this is just some artwork called General Scott's Entrance into Mexico. California Gold Rush. So word about discovery of gold in California quickly spread starting in 1848 and spread so that many people would make their way to the West Coast in search of quick money. So this is a Currier and Ives lithograph from 1849 that just imagines the extreme lengths that people will go to in order to be part of the California Gold Rush. Here you got them in aerial machines, you've got them in boats. This looks like a helicopter or something back here in the back. Anyway, people just trying to reach the ship or to get on the dock so that they can be in California. Something else that came with the California Gold Rush, because people did come from all over, including China. So as people from China came, it's important to understand that we're talking about men from China. Men from China came to California hoping to strike it rich, just like everybody else. Mostly men going out to work in these gold mines or to pan for gold or mine for gold. The idea was that they would strike it rich and go back to China. Very few people brought their families with them. So the Chinese are very much outcast from the beginning of this. And you can see here in this editorialized cartoon from Harper's Weekly in 1869, there's a white man attacking a Chinese man with a whip. And sometimes these Americans would torture Chinese people. They were required by their nation's law to wear the queue, this, long hair as a sign of loyalty, but miners returning to China without it could be put to death. So sometimes the American miners would cut it off, which pretty much just doomed these people once they did go home. People usually ask why, why would Americans treat Chinese this way? Maybe it's because they looked different. Maybe it's because they came from a different place. Maybe it's because they didn't want to share. Maybe it's because they took that as this is their land and they didn't want anyone else taking it. So immigration was not favorable at this time. There have been different times throughout U.S. history where immigration has been helpful, and then where immigration has been cut off because it's deemed as no longer helpful. So immigration kind of is a trend in the United States, and I'll share a video with you about that to explain that a little bit more. And this shows the port of San Francisco in January 1851, just a few months after San Francisco became part of the new U.S. state of California. So that kind of wraps us up for this chapter. Again, I will share a video with you about the trends in immigration because I think you'll find that interesting.